Our next environmental issue is overexploitation. Here are your learning objectives. You'll take the content from this mini lecture and apply it to population and community topics we learned earlier in this unit. Overexploitation is the overuse of natural resources. It occurs when we exploit more of these materials than can be replaced. Examples include lumber or trees. Deforestation is a form of overexploitation. We can overexploit animals, for example, catching more fish than can reproduce and grow in a year. Many plants are overexploited, like ginseng, a medicinal herb that grows in North Carolina. We overexploit fresh water, metals, and fossil fuels as well. The concept of overexploitation was known for a long time, but a famous paper written in the 1960s brought this idea to the masses. It was called The Tragedy of the Commons. The idea was that there would be this field in a small community called the Commons, where community members could bring their livestock to graze. Since there was no cost to an individual, the more livestock a person brought, the more profit they made. There was an individual incentive to use more of this public resource. More and more animals brought in more and more money. The results, as you can imagine, was that the commons were depleted and no one could raise livestock in that area. Many business majors also learn about the tragedy of the commons. That paper was actually written by an economist. The concept also involves politics, sociology, psychology, and more. While it's applicable in many fields, it's most applicable in environmental concepts like pollution, overexploitation, and climate change. It generally has 3 requirements. First, there must be a free or low-cost resource. That's any price below the full sustainable cost. Many of us pay for water, for example, but it's a much lower price than the water is actually worth. This is because water is required for our survival, hygiene, cooking, etc. There are public subsidies to reduce the price. There are also free or low-cost resources like fish. You may have to pay for a license, but the more fish a person takes, the more they individually benefit. Companies might pay for mining rights, but they don't pay the full cost of the use of that resource and the environmental problems mining creates. The second requirement is that individuals must benefit by using more, which I think makes sense. And the third requirement is that the resource must be limited. Since pretty much all resources are limited, that one's a pretty easy requirement to meet as well. The result is that individuals benefit by overusing resources, and ultimately they will do so until few or no resources are left. The concept of the tragedy of the commons should remind you of something else we've learned about. What is it? The answer is carrying capacity. Carrying capacity for a population is set by the environment. If the population uses too many resources or produces too many wastes, the environment pushes back through competition. In the case of the commons, the depleted fields would cause competition between people or starvation of livestock if they compete for reduced resources. Elinor Ostrom won the 2009 Nobel Award for Economics for her work on the tragedy of the commons. As we've discussed throughout this unit, energy in an ecosystem and money have a lot of things in common. Dr. Ostrom mapped out a way to overcome the tragedy of the commons through community agreements, cultural norms, and cooperation rather than competition. See? Mutualism is a solution. One related aspect of overexploitation is deforestation. The resource in this case could be trees, or the carbon-rich soils beneath the forest, or just the land area. Many nations around the world have seen massive declines in their old-growth forests. One example is seen on these maps. Forests of the world have declined by over 200 million acres in the past 30 years. When parts of a forest are cut, it divides the remaining forest into smaller pieces. The habitat becomes fragmented. Different species need different types or amounts of habitat. Certain species survive well on the edge of a forest, and certain species need the interior. When we fragment a forest, we create more edges and less interior. Interior species, ones that require large amounts of land, are often top predators. They usually need more space because they need more energy. As we learned in the predation mini lecture, being at the top of the food web means you have the least amount of energy available to you. Therefore, they need access to greater area to get that energy. The habitat impacts the predators, but the predators also impact the habitat. Why? Predators are often keystone species. They have an outsized impact on the other species in that community. If, for example, habitat fragmentation limits the number of wolves in an area, then the loss of those wolves will allow deer populations to grow, which would then decimate the plant species and could reduce the number of species that community can support overall. What are some solutions to deforestation? Many localities are emphasizing urban renewal to limit the spread of people and limit the amount of area we take. There are also interesting infrastructure projects resulting from some very cool research. Corridors are narrow strips of forest that connect two larger pieces and allow animals to move from one fragment to another. This picture is of a habitat bridge. It connects two large areas of forest over a highway that fragmented that habitat. There are also tunnels that run underneath large roadways to connect areas and limit the number of animals killed on the road. Other solutions for overexploitation include laws that restrict or limit our use of some of these resources, or price adjustments so that people who use more of a resource also pay more. Some people argue for privatization to preserve habitats and resources. There are many societies, though, that have managed resources through social structures and traditions. These mini lectures have focused on the taking of resources. Our next set of mini lectures will focus on the creation of waste.